Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a nation that's navigated immense challenges and pulled off one of the most remarkable economic growth stories of our time. We're talking about Bangladesh, a country that has lifted millions out of poverty and now stands at a critical juncture, charting its course 50 years into the future with really ambitious goals for prosperity. But just like its rivers, its future is shaped by powerful, interconnected currents.
Right, and the sources you've shared give us a fantastic lens to look at those forces. They cover Bangladesh's economic trajectory, the development of its, vast human capital, and the severe environmental pressures it faces.
Yeah.
What's fascinating is how these aren't separate stories, they're deeply intertwined.
Exactly. So this is our deep dive into those sources. Our mission here is to extract the most important nuggets, find those, surprising facts, and help you understand what's truly critical about Bangladesh's path forward. It's about getting a shortcut to being well-informed on a complex, dynamic nation.
Think of it as distilling the essence of this material into, actionable insights.
Let's start with the economic engine then. The numbers presented in the sources are quite striking.
They really are. They show a trajectory of significant growth. By 2025, the nominal GDP is projected to reach, $467.2 billion, positioning Bangladesh around 35th globally.
Okay.
And in purchasing power parity terms, which, accounts for the relative cost of goods, it's expected to hit $1.78 trillion, ranking 24th worldwide.
24th, wow.
Yeah, and we've seen robust growth rates, over 5.8% in 2023, projected to continue around 4 to 4.5% over the next couple of years. This pushes GDP per capita, also in PPP terms, towards $10,000 by 2025.
Those are impressive headline numbers, definitely signaling a major economic shift. But the sources also highlight that this growth story isn't without its significant domestic challenges.
That's a crucial part of the picture, absolutely. You see high inflation cited at over 9% recently. And despite massive poverty reduction, 18.7% of the population still lives below the poverty line. And the Gini coefficient, which measures income inequality, stands at 31.8, indicating a medium but, persistent level of disparity.
So the growth is real.
But ensuring it's inclusive and doesn't leave people behind, especially with rising costs, that's a core challenge revealed in this data. It's not just about the top-line number.
Now, here's a point the sources make that I found particularly insightful. The structure of the economy has transformed dramatically, but the labor force hasn't quite followed suit at the same pace.
This is a critical disconnect.
Yeah.
The sources show services contributing over 53% to GDP now, and industry almost 34%. Agriculture's share of the economy has shrunk down to below 13%. That looks like a modernizing economy.
Right. Fewer resources needed to produce food and crops, efficiency gains, that makes sense. But then you look at where people actually work.
Exactly. And the surprising fact here is that agriculture still employs the largest share of the labor force, 40.6%.
So less than 13% of the economic output, but over 40% of the workers. That's a huge structural imbalance.
It fundamentally means a large segment of the workforce is in a sector with relatively low productivity compared to industry or services. The key insight here is the urgent need for, large-scale workforce reallocation, helping people move to more productive sectors and significant skill upgrading.
Because without that?
Well, without this, you risk widespread underemployment, potentially making inequality worse, and really hindering sustained growth. This isn't just a statistical quirk, it's a real bottleneck for future prosperity.
Okay, so the economy structure has shifted ahead of where a huge portion of its workers are in terms of sector contribution. Let's talk about the industrial engine driving that 34% GDP contribution.
We're ready, mate.
Garment sector, or RMG.
Ah, yes, RNG. It is the undisputed powerhouse. The sources highlight it contributes 38% to GDP.
38%.
And accounts for over 86% of export earnings. Massive. This has made Bangladesh the second largest textile exporter globally. And, they've also made impressive strides in sustainability within the sector, having the highest number of green garment factories with LA certification worldwide.
That's a significant achievement on the green front.
Yeah.
But relying so heavily on one product, garments, feels inherently vulnerable, though, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It's a classic risk. And the sources confirm the government is actively working to diversify exports and industrial output. They're targeting sectors like agro-processing, leather goods, pharmaceuticals, software ICT, shipbuilding, and particularly light engineering.
Light engineering, right. That seems to be one they're highlighting as having significant potential.
It is. The data shows it's a rapidly expanding sector. You've got over 40,000 enterprises employing around 1 million people. It contributes maybe 2–3% to GDP currently, but it has shown remarkable growth, a compound annual growth rate, CAGR, of over 22% between 2017 and 2022.
22% CAGR, that's fast.
Very fast. And it has strong export potential in specific niches like bicycles and certain electrical equipment.
Okay, but even with these growing sectors like light engineering, the sources note that the overall industrial base is still maybe less sophisticated than many competitor countries.
That's right, and it's reflected in Bangladesh's economic complexity ranking 113 out of 133 countries.
That's quite low.
It is. Economic complexity basically measures the knowledge embedded in a country's export basket. So this low ranking indicates a continued heavy reliance on relatively low-value, less differentiated exports, like basic garments.
Which makes the economy vulnerable.
Exactly. Vulnerable to external shocks, price fluctuations, and it limits the amount of value captured domestically. Partly because many materials for RMG still need to be imported. There's a lack of strong local input industries, what economists call backward linkages.
So why should this industrial mix and the push for diversification matter to you listening right now?
Well, it connects directly to global supply chains. Many of the clothes you wear, or perhaps components and goods you use, likely come from or pass through Bangladesh. Understanding this economic base, its strengths, its heavy reliance on RMG, and its drive to diversify gives you insight into the production backbone for many everyday items globally.
And maybe where things are headed.
Precisely. It reveals where future opportunities and, frankly, vulnerabilities might lie in those supply chains we all depend on.
Okay, moving beyond industries, the sources detail some truly massive infrastructure investments, these mega projects.
Yes, colossal undertakings. We're talking about things like the Padma Bridge, the Rupur nuclear plant, the Paradeep Seaport, the Metro Rail in Dhaka. These are enormous, capital-intensive projects.
What's the driving force behind pouring so much capital into these?
The sources present them as absolutely integral to achieving those national goals we mentioned: upper middle income status by 2030 and becoming a prosperous nation by 2041. They aim to fundamentally upgrade transport, communication networks, ports, energy infrastructure, the whole system. And they're projected to boost GDP growth by as much as 4%.
A 4% boost just from infrastructure. That's significant on a national scale. And that Paraport project sounds particularly strategic.
It is. The sources highlight that its impact goes well beyond just domestic needs. Projects like Para are explicitly designed to position Bangladesh as a potential regional economic hub.
How so?
By offering deep-sea maritime access, it can serve landlocked neighbors, think Northeast India, Nepal, Bhutan, and potentially even connect to China's southwest.
So this isn't just about Bangladesh's internal logistics, but about potentially transforming regional trade routes.
Precisely. It opens up the possibility for completely new revenue streams like transit fees, logistics services. It could fundamentally alter Bangladesh's strategic economic role in South Asia and maybe even beyond.
Ambitious, yes, but mega projects are kind of notorious for challenges, aren't they?
They are indeed. And the sources acknowledge that these projects have faced cost escalations and time delays. Managing these risks is crucial, as they can put a real strain on public finances. And, their success is vital for actually realizing those projected economic benefits.
So why does Bangladesh's infrastructure development matter to you, the listener?
Well, it impacts global trade routes directly. It affects regional connectivity in a very dynamic part of the world, South Asia. And it signals potential areas for international investment or partnership. It's literally changing the physical and economic map of the region.
Okay, let's shift our focus now to the people who make the economy run, human capital. Your sources show some real successes in getting kids into school initially.
Yes, significant achievements there. They've achieved near universal primary enrollment, which is huge, and impressive gender parity, actually even superiority in secondary enrollment for girls.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Policies like the National Education Policy are in place, and literacy rates for those aged 7 and up are over 74%. These are genuine successes in just getting children into the education system. Access has improved dramatically.
That's fantastic progress on access.
Yeah.
But access isn't the whole story, is it? The quality.
It's not. And the sources reveal a really critical challenge here: learning poverty. An alarming 51% of children at late primary age are not proficient in reading.
51%. Half.
So getting kids into school desks doesn't automatically guarantee they're acquiring those fundamental skills.
Half the children not reading proficiently by the end of primary.
Yeah.
That's a major roadblock for their entire future and the country's.
It absolutely is. And the sources connect this low quality, at least in part, to low primary education expenditure per child, just $223 in PPP terms, which is, get this, 81% below the average for South Asia.
81% below the regional average.
Wow. Yeah. And you see the consequence in dropout rates, too, over 30% at the secondary level, another 21% at higher secondary.
And here's a surprising detail from the sources related to this learning poverty issue. Something about gender.
Yes, it's quite counterintuitive to many common assumptions about gender and education, especially in South Asia. The sources highlight that learning poverty is actually higher for boys than for girls in Bangladesh.
Higher for boys.
Yes. More boys are out of school, and they have lower proficiency at the primary level compared to girls.
That completely reverses the typical narrative we often hear about girls facing more educational barriers.
It does. It points towards perhaps unaddressed factors potentially affecting boys, maybe things like early entry into informal labor or other socioeconomic pressures pulling them out or hindering their learning. It's a kind of hidden educational disparity that has serious long-term implications for the future male workforce.
So why should you care about the quality of basic education in Bangladesh?
Because it directly impacts the capabilities of the future global workforce, and it reveals crucial insights about development models more broadly. It really shows that just getting kids into classrooms isn't enough. The quality of what happens in those classrooms is absolutely paramount for genuine human development and ultimately economic potential.
And that lack of foundational learning connects directly, I imagine, to the next challenge the sources raise, a skills mismatch in the labor market.
Yes, this is identified as a core obstacle. The sources state clearly that there's a significant gap between the skills graduates possess and what employers actually need, particularly in the higher value modern sectors and for more senior roles.
What drives this mismatch? Is it just the learning poverty issue?
That's part of it, but another major factor highlighted is a strong societal preference for traditional university degrees over technical and vocational education and training, what's called TVET.
The perceived prestige.
Exactly. There's a deep-seated cultural association of prestige with academic qualifications. The sources explicitly say this mindset is difficult to change, especially among parents who want the best, or what they perceive as best, for their children.
So even if there's high demand for practical skills in areas like manufacturing or IT, families are still pushing for those conventional university degrees because of the social status attached.
That seems to be a major dynamic. And a consequence of this, according to the sources, is that Bangladesh still primarily exports unskilled or low-skilled labor, unlike some neighboring countries that have managed to build reputations for exporting professionals in specific fields like IT or healthcare.
What are the key skills that are actually needed for Bangladesh's future economy, according to the sources?
Well, they emphasize an urgent demand for digital and IT skills, things like ICT literacy, data analysis, artificial intelligence. Also, green skills for sustainable industries are becoming critical. And those crucial soft skills, leadership, communication, problem solving.
Digital skills especially seem key.
Yes, the demand for IT exports is apparently growing 3 times faster than traditional goods exports. So the pressure to build those skills is immense.
Is the government trying to make TVET, the vocational path, more attractive then?
They are. They're prioritizing TVET and aiming to align it much more closely with the needs of modern manufacturing and services. They seem to be drawing inspiration from successful models in countries like Vietnam.
But it's still facing challenges.
It is. It still battles that negative public perception we talked about. And it faces another notable challenge: very low participation among women. Only 24% of TVET participants, according to the sources, are women.
Only 24% women in vocational training. That seems like a significant missed opportunity, both for individuals and for the economy as a whole.
It really is. The sources indicate that increasing female labor force participation by just 25% could potentially boost Bangladesh's GDP by up to 2.5%.
That's a substantial boost.
It is. So addressing the barriers preventing women from entering TVET, things like early marriage, lack of exposure to options, traditional expectations, it isn't just about gender equity. It's critical for unlocking substantial economic potential and ensuring the country fully benefits from all its human capital.
Let's talk about demographics for a moment. Bangladesh has a massive population, right?
Huge. Around 173 million people. And it's at a crucial phase where it could potentially benefit from a demographic dividend.
The dividend being?
That's where a large proportion of the population is of working age relative to younger and older dependents. This can theoretically boost economic growth because you have more workers per dependent.
That sounds like a powerful advantage on paper.
It has the potential to be, but the sources caution that this dividend isn't automatic. It's not guaranteed.
Yeah.
The age dependency ratio, the number of non-working age people per working age person is actually rising now due to increases in both youth and elderly populations.
So the window might be closing or changing.
It means realizing the dividend requires really strategic investment now in education, training, and health for the youth, and also adequate support structures for the growing elderly population. If it's not managed well, that large population could potentially become an economic burden rather than a boon.
Migration is also a huge part of Bangladesh's human capital story, isn't it?
Absolutely massive. Over 13 million Bangladeshis work abroad, predominantly in the Middle East. Their remittances, the money they send home, are a vital source of foreign exchange and support domestic consumption significantly.
But there are downsides, too.
Yes. Downsides include brain drain skilled workers leaving, and it also contributes to changing demographic patterns, like reduced birth rates in some areas.
And climate change is adding a new and really urgent dimension to migration.
A very severe one. Because of its extreme climate vulnerability, the sources project that climate impacts could displace millions, both internally and potentially externally. Projections suggest 1 in 7 people could be climate migrants by 2050.
1 in 7.
It's a staggering number, and we're already seeing surging internal migration to urban centers, with people seeking jobs in construction and garments, often because their agricultural livelihoods are no longer viable.
This is where the sources reveal some truly alarming human costs associated with this migration.
This is a profoundly disturbing finding. The sources report a disturbingly high prevalence of modern slavery among both internal and international migrants.
Modern slavery, how high?
An estimated 92% prevalence among internal migrants and a shocking 99% among international migrants surveyed in the source material.
99%? That can't be right. That statistic is just staggering. It speaks to a massive human rights crisis intertwined with these migration flows.
It's almost unbelievable, but that's what the data presented suggest for those specific groups studied. They are often trapped in irregular pathways, facing extreme exploitation, terrible wages, and frequently forced into jobs far below their actual skill level.
It highlights that simply looking at migration as an economic factor, or even just a climate adaptation factor, misses this critical, urgent social and ethical dimension.
Completely. It underscores that climate adaptation and development strategies must include robust social protection measures and pathways for safe, regular migration to protect these incredibly vulnerable populations from horrific exploitation.
So why should you, listening, care about Bangladesh's human capital challenges? From learning poverty and the skills mismatch to these migration dynamics and the horrors of modern slavery.
Because it reflects broader global labor market dynamics. It highlights the push factors behind international migration that affect many countries, not just Bangladesh. And it raises profound ethical questions about global supply chains and, frankly, the human cost of vulnerability in our interconnected world. Understanding this helps you see the human side behind the big global economic forces.
Let's look now at how Bangladesh is trying to address some of these human capital challenges through reforms.
Yeah.
What's the overall strategic direction there?
Well, the sources show a pretty clear shift in education policy. They're moving away from purely theoretical academic approaches towards more skills-based learning. And this is supported by large government programs and quite a bit of international aid.
What specific areas are they targeting with these reforms?
There's a major emphasis on STEM science, technology, engineering, and math and ICT education. They've made ICT training mandatory in secondary schools and are working on building digital classrooms.
Preparing for the future economy.
Exactly. The goal is explicitly to prepare the workforce for the demands of the fourth industrial revolution, AI, automation, etc. Also to foster tech entrepreneurship domestically and make Bangladesh more attractive for foreign direct investment, FDI, by signaling they have a digitally skilled workforce.
You mentioned earlier the success in female education access. How does that play into these current reforms?
That earlier success, things like stipends and free textbooks that led to female enrollment parity or even superiority, is crucial groundwork. These current reforms aim to capitalize on that foundation. The goal is to empower women to enter higher skilled sectors now, like IT, health, management roles, moving beyond the more traditional concentration in garments.
So it's about leveraging that past success for future economic gain.
Yes, and it's not just about gender equity, though that's vital. It directly boosts household income and supports overall national development when women participate more fully in higher value sectors.
And are they also tailoring education specifically for people looking to work internationally, the migrants?
Yes, the sources mention an explicit focus on skills needed for global labor markets. That includes language skills, English and Arabic are mentioned, technical certifications relevant abroad, and just general workplace readiness. This is directly aimed at increasing the earning potential of migrants and boosting those vital remittance flows back home.
And linking training to specific industries.
Right. They're trying to create specific training pipelines linked to key growth sectors like logistics, modern manufacturing, export industries to ensure a steady supply of workers with the right skills for those jobs.
The pandemic probably accelerated the use of digital learning too, right? Did the sources mention that?
It did, yeah. And the sources note this has expanded access to education and upskilling opportunities, which is essential for creating a more adaptable and resilient workforce, especially given potential future disruptions.
And that modernization of TVET, the vocational training, seems key to all this.
It's a core component. They're drawing on international examples, trying to align curricula much more closely with actual market needs, putting a strong emphasis on STEM and also green skills, and strengthening partnerships with industry for things like apprenticeships.
They're really trying to make it relevant.
Exactly. Preparing youth for the specific demands of the evolving job market, particularly in manufacturing, but also in emerging green sectors.
Why are these educational and skills reforms important for you to understand?
Well, they offer really valuable insights into how nations are strategically trying to redesign their education systems to meet the demands of a rapidly changing global economy and the future of work. It shows a deliberate effort to build human capital as a central pillar of national development and export competitiveness. And frankly, there are lessons there for other countries facing similar transitions and challenges.
Okay, so we've explored the economic drive, the critical human capital needs and reforms. Now let's turn to a challenge that intersects with and, frankly, amplifies all of this, the environment.
This is arguably the most profound long-term challenge Bangladesh faces. It's existential in many ways. The sources highlight severe environmental concerns across the board, but air pollution is particularly critical.
Air pollution, how bad is it?
Very bad, especially concerning PM 2.5 and PM 10 particles. These are those tiny, fine, inhalable particles.
Smaller than a human hair, right?
Much smaller. They can penetrate deep into the lungs and even the bloodstream. PM 2.5 are especially dangerous, and the sources are diverse. Household cooking, power generation, industry, transport, burning waste, agriculture, construction dust. It's a complex mix.
Are there policies in place to try and tackle this?
Yes, there's the Bangladesh National Air Quality Management Plan for 2024-2030. It sets specific targets like meeting the WHO Interim Target 1 for PM 2.5, which is still quite high, but an improvement and generally improving air quality nationally and especially in highly polluted areas like Dhaka.
And other pollutants.
They also have a national action plan for reducing short-lived climate pollutants, or SLCPs. This targets things like black carbon soot, where traditional brick kilns are identified as a huge source, maybe 20% of total emissions, and also methane, particularly from rice paddies.
It feels like these environmental issues, air pollution, but also things like river pollution, land degradation from brick making, aren't just isolated problems. They must have ripple effects.
They absolutely do. They fundamentally undermine both human capital and economic productivity. Here's a critical link that the sources make. Environmental degradation, particularly high temperatures and the associated air pollution, is directly linked to lower test scores in children.
Lower test scores?
Yes. And it has long-term negative impacts on their educational attainment and their future earnings potential.
So living in polluted or excessively hot conditions can literally hinder a child's ability to learn and then earn later in life.
Yeah.
That's devastating.
Exactly. It creates a truly vicious cycle where environmental problems erode the very human capital that's needed for development and sustained growth. And conversely, policies designed to address this, like shifting away from polluting brick kilns or improving transport emissions, they necessitate changes across multiple industries,
Right.
which in turn creates opportunities for green jobs and pushes industries towards more efficient, less polluting practices.
And then there is the massive overrushing threat of climate change itself.
Yeah, on top of everything else, Bangladesh is consistently ranked as one of the world's most vulnerable countries to climate change impacts. This is despite having contributed very little to the global emissions that are causing the problem.
What kind of impacts are we talking about?
Increasing intensity and frequency of floods, devastating cyclones, storm surges along the coast, and also droughts in other areas. It's a multitude of threats.
And sea level rise must be an existential threat given the low-lying delta geography.
It is truly existential. Projected sea level rises may be 0.3 meters by 2050, potentially 0.74 meters by 2100, could displace millions of people. Millions. The sources highlight a staggering fact. 62% of Bangladesh's coastal lands are less than 3 meters above sea level.
62% below 3 meters.
Which makes them incredibly susceptible to inundation from storm surges and just gradual sea level rise. Plus increasing salinity, which ruins farmland and contaminates drinking water sources. The sources even mention floods could last up to 9 months in some vulnerable areas in future scenarios.
That level of vulnerability is almost hard to comprehend.
Yeah.
What's the economic cost of these climate impacts expected to be?
Well, the overall estimate is that climate change could cost around 2% of annual GDP growth, just through its direct impacts on agriculture, water resources, infrastructure, health, energy.
2% of growth wiped out each year.
Yeah, a constant drag. But the sources provide a particularly stark example related to that crucial RMG sector we discussed. Projected losses of $27 billion annually by 2030.
Okay.
And a staggering $711 billion by 2050 if climate-adaptive policies are not effectively implemented in the sector and its supply chains.
A potential $711 billion loss for their core export industry. It's an unthinkable economic blow. It's not just an environmental issue then.
Not at all. It underscores that for Bangladesh, climate change is not merely an environmental problem or some distant future concern. It is a massive economic threat multiplier today. It jeopardizes trade competitiveness, it deters investment, and it fundamentally threatens long-term economic stability if it's not addressed head-on, proactively.
And the human impact beyond just displacement is also profound, right?
It is. Rising temperatures disproportionately harm vulnerable populations. Think outdoor workers, the elderly, the urban poor living in inadequate housing. And that link we mentioned earlier about high temperatures affecting children's test scores and long-term earnings. That's a direct climate impact on human capital development. Plus, climate-induced migration, as we discussed, exacerbates health issues and existing social inequalities, particularly hitting women and girls harder in many cases. It's a comprehensive threat to human well-being and social equity, demanding integrated public health responses and stronger social safety nets.
So why does climate change in Bangladesh matter so much to you, listening potentially thousands of miles away?
Because it's one of the clearest, most acute illustrations of the global climate crisis unfolding right now. It highlights the very real potential for massive human displacement on a scale we haven't seen. It creates significant supply chain risks for industries globally tied to the region, and it raises critical humanitarian concerns that affect us all. Understanding Bangladesh's vulnerability helps contextualize the global stakes of climate action or inaction.
How is Bangladesh approaching this immense environmental and climate challenge then? What's their strategy?
Their primary flagship response is the Bangladesh Delta Plan 2100, often called BDP 2100. It's a very long-term, visionary, techno-economic plan. Interestingly, it was developed in partnership with the Netherlands, another low-lying country with deep experience in water management.
A Delta plan for the next century. What is the core vision of BDP 2100?
The headline vision is to achieve a safe, climate-resilient, and prosperous delta by the year 2100. But here's the key insight from the sources. It's not conceived as just a standalone environmental plan or a water management plan.
How is it framed then?
It's framed as a comprehensive national development strategy. It explicitly uses climate resilience and sustainable water management as the fundamental pillars upon which to build all their other socioeconomic goals, including achieving upper middle income status, eliminating extreme poverty, and reaching that prosperous nation goal by 2041.
So climate resilience isn't an add-on or something separate they need to deal with. It's foundational to their entire development strategy.
Exactly. It reflects a deep recognition that you simply cannot achieve long-term economic prosperity or sustainable poverty reduction in Bangladesh without fundamentally addressing climate vulnerability and water management challenges head-on. The plan requires substantial, sustained, long-term investment too, estimated at around 2.5% of GDP annually.
2.5% of GDP every year. That's a huge commitment.
What other adaptation strategies are they pursuing besides this big plan?
The sources mention several things. Adopting climate-adaptive technologies in agriculture is key, like developing and distributing flood-resistant or salinity-resistant seeds and promoting improved soil management practices.
Financial solutions are also part of it, like expanding crop insurance and microfinance options to help communities cope with climate shocks and invest in resilience. Promoting alternative building materials, like hollow cement blocks instead of traditional fired bricks, is targeting those major emission sources and also reducing topsoil degradation.
And greening supply chains.
Yes, there's a push to green supply chains, partly driven by pressure from international buyers, especially in the RMG sector. And they're exploring tools like digital product passports, DPPs, to increase transparency about environmental footprints.
And that links back to skills again, doesn't it? Green skills.
Directly. The importance of embedding green skills into the education and training system is highlighted repeatedly. This isn't just about, environmentalism for its own sake. It's framed as a direct economic imperative.
Why economic?
To prepare youth for the growing number of jobs in greening industries, to maintain export competitiveness, especially as major RMG buyers increasingly demand sustainability, to attract green foreign direct investment, and ultimately to future-proof the entire economy in a world shifting towards sustainability.
What can you learn from Bangladesh's strategic approach to climate adaptation? Seems quite comprehensive.
I think you see the absolute necessity of integrated planning, weaving environmental resilience and climate adaptation directly into the fabric of national development strategy, not treating it as a separate silo. It also highlights the immense scale of investment required, especially for highly vulnerable nations. And it underscores the crucial role of technological innovation, financial solutions, and international partnerships in building resilience effectively.
Okay, let's try and bring all these different threads together now.
Yeah.
Listening to all this, it really sounds like Bangladesh's next 50 years are shaped by a deeply interconnected, almost tangled set of forces.
They absolutely are. You can't really separate them. The ambition for economic growth and diversification is inextricably linked to developing its human capital. That means addressing those skill gaps we talked about, improving education quality from the foundation up, somehow overcoming that cultural preference for theoretical degrees over practical skills, and crucially, fully leveraging female potential by tackling barriers in areas like TVET.
And the demographic dividend isn't guaranteed.
No, it's totally contingent on making those smart, targeted investments in people in health, education, and skills for the youth, and support for the elderly.
And the environment isn't just a backdrop to all this, but a major active force interacting with both the economy and the people.
Precisely. Climate change in particular acts as this powerful threat multiplier. It impacts economic productivity, trade, investment attractiveness, and it fundamentally challenges human capital development and social equity. You see that clearly with climate-induced migration and the horrifying exploitation that can follow.
So the path forward really involves addressing all these complex challenges simultaneously. It's not pick and choose.
That seems to be the core takeaway from the sources, yes. Sustained growth and achieving those ambitious prosperity goals requires integrated policies. Policies that simultaneously drive economic diversification, invest deeply and strategically in demand-driven human capital, addressing those specific gaps and cultural barriers, and aggressively implement climate adaptation and mitigation strategies to protect the population, protect resources, and protect the economic gains already made.
It requires immense foresight, coordination, and resilience.
Absolutely. Paramount is probably the right word.
It's an incredible balancing act. They're pursuing these really ambitious economic goals while facing such urgent human development needs and these truly severe environmental threats.
It really represents the defining challenge of their future. And frankly, it makes Bangladesh a fascinating and incredibly important case study in complex national development in the 21st century.
Well, thank you for sharing the sources that allowed us to take this deep dive into the forces shaping Bangladesh's future. It really highlights those intricate, often challenging connections.
It's been very insightful to pull it all together.
And it leaves us, and you listening, with something quite compelling to consider, I think. How does a nation facing environmental risks that seem almost insurmountable, like vast coastal lands potentially being lost to sea level rise, like core industries facing hundreds of billions in potential climate-driven losses, how does such a nation not just strive to survive, but actively plan and invest to thrive and become prosperous in the face of that daunting reality?
Mm-hmm.
What lessons can other countries facing their own unique but often related climate and development challenges draw from Bangladesh's comprehensive, integrated approach to building resilience while still relentlessly pursuing progress?